Imagine a world without electricity, without heating systems, without the grocery store around the corner. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a vast forest as the first snowflakes begin to fall, knowing that this gentle beginning marks the start of a season that will test every skill you possess, every lesson you've learned, and every bond you share with your community. This was the reality for our ancestors, people who lived thousands of years ago when winter wasn't just an inconvenience but a formidable opponent that demanded respect, preparation, and an intimate understanding of nature's rhythms. In the heart of what we now call Northern Europe, around 12,000 years ago, there lived a small community of people who had learned to read the language of the land. They noticed how the squirrels gathered more nuts than usual, how the birds began their migration earlier, how the bears grew restless in their search for food. These weren't just interesting observations, they were survival intelligence, the difference between life and death when the long winter came. The elders of the tribe, their faces weathered by countless seasons, would gather the younger members and share the knowledge that had been passed down through generations, stories that contained within them the secrets of survival. Among these people was a young woman named Eira, whose name in her language meant snow. She had seen 17 winters, each one teaching her something new about the delicate balance between human will and nature's power. Eira lived with her extended family in a settlement of about 40 people, nestled in a valley where a river provided fish year-round and the surrounding hills offered shelter from the harshest winds. Their homes were not the flimsy structures one might imagine but sophisticated dwellings dug partially into the earth, with walls made of stacked stones, packed earth, and wooden frames covered with animal hides. The roofs were ingeniously designed with multiple layers, first branches, then dried grass, then more hides, and finally a thick coating of earth that provided insulation against the bitter cold. The construction of these dwellings was itself a testament to accumulated knowledge spanning hundreds of generations. Each dwelling took several months to build properly, requiring the coordinated effort of multiple families. The location had to be chosen carefully, always on slightly elevated ground to prevent flooding from melting snow, but also protected from the strongest winds. The entrance always faced away from the prevailing winter winds, and many dwellings had a short tunnel entrance that created an airlock effect, preventing the precious warm air from escaping every time someone entered or exited. Inside, the floor was covered with layers of dried grass and furs, replaced regularly to maintain cleanliness and warmth. The central fire pit was lined with specific types of stones that could withstand extreme heat without cracking, stones that had been carefully selected from the riverbed and tested over time. As autumn painted the leaves in shades of gold and crimson, the entire community shifted into preparation mode. This wasn't a sudden change but a gradual intensification of activity that had actually begun in spring. Eira and the other women spent their days gathering every edible plant they could find. They collected hazelnuts, acorns, and beechnuts, storing them in underground pits lined with bark to keep them dry. They dug up roots of cattails and wild carrots, slicing them thin and drying them on racks near the fire. Berries were mashed and dried into cakes that would last for months. Nothing was wasted, nothing overlooked. The children, even the smallest ones who could barely walk, were given tasks appropriate to their abilities. They gathered kindling, sorted nuts, and learned by watching and imitating their elders. The men of the tribe, including Eira's father Corin and her older brother Davin, focused on hunting. But this wasn't the casual hunting of summer when game was plentiful and the weather forgiving. This was strategic, calculated hunting aimed at securing enough meat to last through the long dark months. They tracked deer herds, studying their patterns and movements. They set up elaborate traps for smaller game like rabbits and foxes. When they successfully brought down a large animal, the entire community would participate in processing it. Every single part of the animal was used. The meat was cut into strips and smoked over fires made from specific woods that imparted flavor and preservation properties. The fat was rendered and stored in cleaned bladders and intestines, precious calories that would be crucial when other food ran low. The bones were cracked open for their marrow, then saved to be made into tools, needles, and ornaments. The hides were scraped clean, treated with a mixture of brain matter and other natural chemicals, then stretched and dried to make clothing, blankets, and repairs for the dwelling walls. The processing of hides was an art form in itself, one that Eira had been learning since she was a small child. The hide had to be stretched on a frame immediately after the flesh was scraped away, or it would become stiff and unusable. The brain tanning process required patience and strength. The animal's brain was mashed into a paste, mixed with water, and worked into every part of the hide. This process had to be repeated multiple times, with the hide being stretched and worked constantly to keep it supple. The final step involved smoking the hide over a low fire, which not only gave it a beautiful golden brown color but also made it water resistant and preserved it from decay. A single large hide could take several days of continuous work to prepare properly, but the result was a material that was warm, durable, and could last for years with proper care. Eira had a special talent that set her apart in her community. She had learned from her grandmother how to create fire-starting materials that would work even in damp conditions. She would collect specific types of fungus that grew on birch trees, processing them through a careful series of steps involving boiling, pounding, and drying. She also prepared bundles of the finest, driest plant fibers, kept in waterproof containers made from folded bark and sealed with pine resin. These fire-starting kits were distributed to each family group, a backup for the main fires that were kept burning continuously throughout the winter. But Eira's knowledge went deeper than just fire starting. She understood the properties of different woods, knowing which burned hot and fast for cooking, which burned slow and steady for overnight warmth, which produced the least smoke, and which were best for smoking meat. This knowledge had been accumulated over countless generations, each piece of information tested and verified through experience, sometimes harsh experience. As the days grew shorter and the temperature dropped, Eira noticed the subtle signs that the elder women had taught her to watch for. The wild geese had all departed, their haunting calls fading to silence. The evergreen trees seemed to draw themselves inward, their needles darkening and their branches drooping slightly as they prepared for the weight of snow. The air itself changed, becoming drier and sharper, carrying scents from farther away. One morning, Eira's grandmother, a woman named Sura who had survived more than 60 winters, announced that the deep cold would arrive within 7 days. She had never been wrong. Sura's predictions were based on a lifetime of observation, but also on knowledge passed down from her own grandmother and the generations before. She could read the thickness of animal fur, the behavior of insects, the patterns of frost on the ground, and the quality of light in the sky. Each of these signs told part of the story, and together they painted a picture of what was coming. The community redoubled their efforts. The last of the fish were caught and smoked. The storage pits were checked and rechecked. Firewood, which had been collected all summer and fall, was stacked carefully near each dwelling, with the driest wood kept closest to the entrances. Additional supplies were placed in a communal storage area, a safeguard against individual family shortages. They also prepared what they called the dark shelter, a special dwelling used if conditions became so severe that normal activities were impossible. This shelter was stocked with emergency supplies and could house the entire community if necessary. It was built into the side of a hill, with extra thick walls and multiple fire pits. The entrance was designed so that it could be completely sealed if needed, with leather curtains layered one after another to create an insulated barrier against the outside world. The community also conducted a ceremony on the last day before the predicted arrival of the deep cold. This wasn't mere superstition but a crucial psychological practice that helped bind the community together and prepare everyone mentally for what lay ahead. The entire settlement gathered in the largest dwelling, one specifically designed for communal activities. A fire was built up until it roared, filling the space with heat and flickering light. The elders spoke, reminding everyone of the challenges ahead but also of past winters survived, of the strength that came from working together, of the knowledge they possessed that would see them through. Young people who had come of age since the last winter were formally recognized as adults, ready to take on full responsibilities. Eira's younger cousin, a boy named Torin who had just turned 14, was among them. He looked nervous but proud as the elders marked his face with a mixture of charcoal and fat, a symbol of his new status. Then, on the seventh day, just as Sura had predicted, the first serious snowfall began. It started gently, almost playfully, but within hours the flakes grew larger and fell more thickly. By evening, the world had transformed into a realm of white silence. The temperature plummeted, and the wind began to howl through the valley with a voice that sounded almost alive, almost angry. This was the beginning of what Eira's people called the Long Night, a period that would last until the spring sun finally gained enough strength to push back the darkness. Life during the deep winter was nothing like the constant activity of the warmer months. The community lived by the rhythms of light and darkness, conserving their energy and their resources with careful discipline. Each family would wake in their dwelling as the pale morning light filtered through the smoke hole in the roof. The fire, which had been banked carefully at night, would be stirred back to life. This was a critical task, one usually performed by the eldest competent person in the household. Fire meant life, and letting it die was unthinkable. The process of banking a fire was itself a skill that took years to master. The coals had to be arranged just right, covered with ash to slow their burning but not smother them completely, positioned so that they would last through the long night but be easy to revive in the morning. Breakfast was simple but nourishing, a porridge made from ground nuts and grain, enriched with a bit of rendered fat and perhaps some dried berries. Hot drinks were made from pine needles or fermented herbs, providing vitamin C and warmth. After the morning meal, the day's tasks would be divided. Some people would venture outside to check the animal traps, to gather more firewood from the protected stacks, or to hunt if conditions permitted. Others would remain inside, working on essential crafts and repairs. Eira spent many of her winter days working on clothing and tools. She would sit near the fire, her fingers moving with practiced skill as she sewed garments from the prepared hides, using needles made from bone and thread made from sinew. She was making a new winter coat for her younger sister, a girl of 8 named Lyra who was growing rapidly and whose old coat no longer fit properly. This wasn't just practical work, it was an act of love, each stitch a protection against the cold that waited outside their walls. The coat required careful planning. It needed to be large enough to accommodate layers of clothing beneath it, but not so large that it would be clumsy or waste precious materials. The seams had to be tight enough to keep out wind and snow, but flexible enough to allow movement. Eira was also decorating the coat with small patterns made from strips of darker hide, not just for beauty but to mark it as belonging to their family, a way of identifying each other even in the blowing snow when faces might be covered. The dwellings were surprisingly comfortable, though nothing like modern standards. The combination of the earth's insulation, the multiple layers of the roof and walls, and the constant fire kept the interior temperature bearable even when the outside air was cold enough to freeze exposed skin within minutes. The smoke from the fire rose naturally through the hole in the roof, though on particularly windy days, the interior could become quite smoky. People learned to breathe carefully and to keep their sleeping areas lower, where the air was clearer. The smell inside was a mixture of smoke, cooked food, cured hides, and human bodies, but to the inhabitants, this was simply the smell of home, of safety, of survival. But winter was not just about physical survival. The long dark months could be just as challenging mentally and emotionally. This was something the community understood well, and they had developed ways to maintain their spirits during the difficult season. Storytelling was perhaps the most important of these practices. As night fell and the family gathered close to the fire, the elders would tell stories. These were not just entertainment but a crucial way of passing down knowledge, history, and values. Sura, Eira's grandmother, was one of the most respected storytellers. She would recount tales of great hunters and wise women from the past, stories of how the community had overcome previous harsh winters, and myths about the spirits of nature that explained the world around them. One particular night, when the wind was screaming so loudly that it seemed it might tear the roof from their dwelling, Sura told a story that Eira had heard many times before but which seemed especially relevant. It was the tale of the winter of no end, a terrible season 3 generations ago when the snow had fallen continuously for so long that the food supplies had run dangerously low. In that desperate time, the community had been forced to make difficult decisions about rationing, and they had learned important lessons about cooperation and sacrifice. The story wasn't just about hardship, though, it was about how the people had maintained their humanity even in the darkest times, how they had shared what little they had, and how they had emerged from that winter not just alive but stronger and more united. Sura's voice rose and fell with the rhythm of the story, her hands moving expressively in the firelight, and every person listening was transported back to that terrible time, feeling the fear and cold, but also the courage and solidarity that had saved their ancestors. The story also contained practical wisdom hidden within its narrative. It described which foods were eaten first when supplies ran low, which could be stretched the furthest, and which absolutely had to be saved for the very end. It talked about a plant that could be harvested even in deep winter if you knew where to look, one that grew beneath the snow near certain types of rocks. It mentioned a technique for making bone broth that could extract every bit of nutrition from the skeleton of an animal. These weren't separate lessons tacked onto the story, they were woven into the fabric of the narrative so naturally that listeners absorbed the information without even realizing they were being taught. As the weeks passed and the winter deepened, the community faced various challenges. One family's dwelling developed a dangerous crack in one of the walls, allowing cold air to seep in. The entire community came together to help repair it, bringing materials and expertise. This wasn't charity, it was simply how they lived. They understood that they were all connected, that one family's misfortune could become everyone's problem if not addressed quickly. The repair took most of a day, with people working in shifts because the cold made it impossible to stay outside for too long. They packed the crack with a mixture of clay, grass, and animal hair, then covered it with hides on both the inside and outside. When they were done, the dwelling was actually more secure than it had been before the damage occurred. Food management was a constant concern. The community had learned through hard experience to ration their supplies carefully. Each family was responsible for managing their own stores, but the elders kept a general awareness of everyone's situation. When Eira's family processed their food for the day, they did so with careful consideration. Nothing was wasted. Bones were boiled repeatedly to extract every bit of nutrition. Even the water used for cooking was saved and reused, as it contained valuable nutrients and calories. Scraps that humans couldn't eat were given to the dogs, semi-wild animals that lived on the edge of the settlement and served as both guards and hunting companions. In desperate times, those dogs might themselves become food, but for now they were valued members of the community. Protein was especially precious during the winter. The stored and smoked meat had to last, so it was consumed sparingly, often mixed with other foods to make it go further. Eira's mother, Eira, was skilled at creating nourishing meals from limited ingredients. She would make stews that combined small amounts of meat with stored roots, dried berries, and ground nuts, creating dishes that were both filling and nutritious. Fat was added to almost everything, as the high-calorie content was essential for maintaining body heat and energy. One of Eira's specialties was a particular type of traveling food, small cakes made from rendered fat, dried meat, and crushed nuts. These were incredibly dense in calories and could sustain a person through a day of hard work in the cold. They didn't taste particularly good, but they kept you alive, and that was what mattered. Despite all their preparations and careful management, there were still dangers. Illness was perhaps the most feared, as someone who became sick in winter might not survive. The community had healers, women, and men who had learned the properties of various plants and treatments. They knew which herbs could reduce fever, which could ease pain, which could help with wounds. But their knowledge had limits, and sometimes people died despite their best efforts. The healers maintained a supply of dried medicinal plants, carefully stored and labeled. There were leaves that could be made into tea to ease coughing, roots that could be chewed to numb pain, bark that could be boiled to reduce fever, and fungi that could prevent wounds from becoming infected. Some of these medicines had been discovered through careful observation of animal behavior, others had been found through trial and error over many generations. Around the midpoint of winter, during the darkest days when the sun barely rose above the horizon, a crisis struck. A hunting party, including Eira's brother Davin, had gone out during what seemed like a break in the weather. They were tracking a deer they had spotted near the settlement. But the weather in winter could change with terrifying speed. A storm blew in suddenly, and the hunters found themselves caught in what the community called a white death, a blizzard so intense that visibility dropped to almost nothing and the cold became immediately life-threatening. Davin and his companions had been trained for such emergencies. They knew that trying to continue back to the settlement in these conditions would be fatal. Instead, they did what their training dictated: they found shelter. There was a small cave nearby, one they had identified earlier as a potential emergency refuge. They made their way to it, supporting each other, and managed to get inside before the storm reached its full fury. Once there, they used the emergency supplies each hunter carried: fire-starting materials, extra clothing, and a small amount of food. They built a fire at the mouth of the cave, creating a barrier against the wind and cold. The smoke was bad, especially at first, but it was better than freezing to death. They took turns keeping the fire going and watching for any change in the weather. Each hunter carried what they called a survival bundle, a leather pouch containing flint and steel, tinder fungus, dried meat, a small knife, and extra cordage. These bundles had saved countless lives over the generations. Back at the settlement, the failure of the hunting party to return caused immediate concern. Corin, Eira's father, wanted to go search for them immediately, but Sura and the other elders counseled patience. Going out in these conditions would only create more victims. They had to trust that Davin and the others had found shelter and would return when the storm passed. This was one of the hardest parts of ancient survival. Sometimes you had to wait, had to trust, had to accept that you couldn't control everything. The discipline required to make these decisions was immense. Every instinct screamed to take action, to do something, but the accumulated wisdom of generations said otherwise. For 2 days and nights, the storm raged. Eira and her family kept their fire burning, but the worry was constant. Eira's mother moved through the dwelling mechanically, doing her tasks but speaking little. Lyra, the younger sister, cried quietly at night. Eira tried to remain strong, but she found herself thinking about all the times she and Davin had spent together, the lessons he had taught her, the jokes they had shared. She realized how fragile life was, how quickly someone could be taken away. She spent hours making small repairs to Davin's hunting gear, preparing it for his return, refusing to consider any other possibility. It was a way of maintaining hope, of keeping her hands busy while her mind churned with worry. On the third morning, the storm finally broke. The wind died down, and though the cold remained intense, the sky cleared to a brilliant blue. Within an hour of the weather clearing, a search party had been organized. Corin led the group, which included several of the best trackers and most experienced winter travelers in the community. Eira begged to go with them, but her father refused. The conditions were still dangerous, and he needed people who could move quickly and handle emergencies. More importantly, he needed people at the settlement to keep preparing for the worst, to be ready to receive the hunters if they were found injured or suffering from severe cold exposure. The searchers were gone for what felt like an eternity but was actually only about 6 hours. When they finally appeared on the ridge above the settlement, Eira's heart leaped. She could see 7 figures, the same number that had gone out hunting. All the hunters had survived. They were exhausted, hungry, and suffering from frostbite on their fingers and faces, but they were alive. The relief that washed over the community was palpable, almost physical in its intensity. The reunions were emotional but brief. The hunters needed immediate care. They were brought into the warmest dwelling, given hot drinks, and their frostbitten areas were treated with a careful process that involved gradually warming the affected areas while applying poultices made from specific plant materials. The healers worked with calm efficiency, and over the following days, all the hunters recovered, though some lost the tips of fingers or toes to the cold. Davin was among those who lost part of a finger, the smallest digit on his left hand. It would affect his ability to grip certain tools, but he was alive and would adapt. The community had many members who bore the scars of winter's bite, each mark a testament to survival. This incident reinforced lessons the community already knew but which each generation had to relearn through experience. Nature was not their enemy, but neither was it their friend. It was simply a force, indifferent to human wishes, following its own patterns and rhythms. Survival meant respecting that force, understanding it, preparing for it, and knowing when to push forward and when to wait. The young cousin Torin, who had been formally recognized as an adult just before winter began, took these lessons particularly to heart. He had been close to joining that hunting party but had been held back because of his inexperience. Now he understood why. Being brave wasn't about taking risks, it was about knowing which risks were worth taking and which were foolish. As winter continued, the community settled into a deeper pattern of patience. The days began to lengthen almost imperceptibly. The celebrations of the winter solstice, when the community gathered for a special feast and ceremony, marked the psychological turning point. They knew that even though the coldest weather was still ahead, the sun was beginning its return. This knowledge was incredibly important for morale. It gave them something to look forward to, a promise that the winter would end. The solstice celebration involved the entire community gathering in the largest dwelling for a feast that used more of their stored food than they would normally consume in several days. But this apparent wastefulness was actually a strategic decision. The psychological benefit of the celebration, the boost to morale and community cohesion, was worth the cost in food. People needed hope, needed joy, needed something to mark the turning of the season. During the feast, There was singing and dancing, activities that generated warmth and brought people together. Children played games that had been passed down for generations, games that often contained within them lessons about survival and cooperation. Adults engaged in friendly competitions of skill, throwing competitions with spears and knives, contests of strength, demonstrations of craft excellence. Eira presented the finished coat she had made for Lyra, and her sister's face lit up with joy as she tried it on. It fit perfectly, and the decorative patterns Eira had added made it beautiful as well as functional. Sura gave Eira a special gift, a necklace made from carefully shaped pieces of amber that had been in their family for countless generations. Amber was precious, not just because it was beautiful but because it was believed to hold protective power. By giving this to Eira, Sura was marking her as someone special, someone who would carry forward the wisdom of their people. Eira used the deep winter time to learn more from her grandmother. Sura had decided that this winter would be when she passed on some of her most closely held knowledge. On long afternoons, the two women would sit together, and Sura would teach Eira about the more subtle aspects of survival. She taught her how to read weather patterns in the behavior of animals and the appearance of the sky. She taught her about the medicinal properties of plants, which ones could be used for which ailments, how to prepare them, and in what quantities. She taught her about the spiritual aspects of their world, the beliefs that gave meaning to their existence. One lesson particularly struck Eira. Sura told her that the most important survival skill wasn't strength or knowledge of plants or ability with weapons. The most important skill was the ability to remain calm, to think clearly when everything around you was chaos and danger. Fear will kill you faster than cold, Sura said. The person who panics, who lets their mind scatter, that person makes fatal mistakes. But the person who can breathe, who can think, who can act with purpose even when terrified, that person will survive. She illustrated this with a story from her own youth, a time when she had fallen through thin ice while crossing a frozen stream. The natural reaction would have been to thrash and panic, but she had forced herself to remain calm, to move slowly and deliberately, to break a path through the ice to the shore rather than trying to pull herself up onto the remaining ice which would only have broken further. That calmness had saved her life. Sura also taught Eira about the ethical dimensions of survival. In desperate times, people could be tempted to take more than their fair share, to hoard resources, to put their own family's needs above the community's. But Sura explained that this was ultimately self-defeating. A community that broke apart under pressure was a community of dead people. Only by maintaining their bonds, by continuing to share and cooperate even when resources were scarce, could they all survive. She told stories of communities that had failed this test, where greed and fear had led to fighting and division, and how those communities had not survived the winter. The lesson was clear: individual survival was impossible, only community survival was real. As winter began its slow retreat, the community's activities gradually increased. The sun rose earlier and set later. The temperature, while still cold by modern standards, began to moderate slightly. The most experienced hunters ventured out more frequently, finding that game animals were starting to move more actively. They brought back fresh meat for the first time in weeks, a welcome addition to their diet of stored and dried foods. The fresh meat tasted different, somehow more alive, and it lifted everyone's spirits. One morning, Eira was checking the snares near the settlement when she heard a sound that made her heart sing, the call of geese flying north. She looked up and saw the distinctive V formation against the pale blue sky. It was early yet, there would likely be more cold weather, possibly even heavy snow. But the geese knew. They could feel the change coming, could sense that the balance was shifting from winter to spring. Eira stood there for a long moment, watching the geese disappear into the distance, feeling the stirring of hope and renewal. The community's food stores had held, though they were significantly depleted. This had been a good winter in terms of management and planning, but not all winters went so well. Surya told Eira that she had lived through 3 winters when the food had run out before spring arrived, when the community had been forced to survive on the bare minimum, eating things they normally wouldn't touch, losing weight and strength until the first spring plants appeared. But they had survived those winters too, and the knowledge of how they had done so had been incorporated into their collective wisdom. They had learned which tree bark could be eaten, which lichens provided some nutrition, how to dig through snow and frozen earth to find roots that other animals might have cached. These were desperate measures, but they were measures that worked. One of those terrible winters, Surya recounted, had taught them about ice fishing when all other food sources had been exhausted. The river never froze completely because of its current, but there were areas where the ice was thick enough to support a person. The men had learned to chip holes through the ice and to fashion hooks from bone and line from braided plant fiber. The fish they caught this way were small and the process was slow and cold, but those fish had kept them alive. Now, ice fishing was part of their regular winter survival strategy, not just a desperate last resort. As the snow began to melt and the first green shoots appeared in the forest, the community emerged from their winter mode like a plant emerging from dormancy. There was a renewed energy, a sense of relief and accomplishment. They had made it through another winter. Not everyone had survived, 2 elders had died of illness, and a baby had been stillborn during the coldest month. These losses were mourned, but death was a constant companion in this ancient world, and the people had learned to honor the dead while continuing to focus on the living. The 2 elders who had passed were given traditional ceremonies, their bodies placed in a special location with items they had valued in life, covered with stones to protect them from scavengers. The community would remember their wisdom and their contributions, and their stories would continue to be told. The spring work began immediately. The hunting intensified to replenish depleted stores. The women began gathering the first spring greens, precious sources of nutrients after the long winter. These early plants, some of them appearing even before the snow had completely melted, were rich in the vitamins and minerals that had been scarce in their winter diet. Eira joined the gathering parties eagerly, enjoying the feeling of sun on her face and the smell of earth awakening. The fields where they encouraged certain plants to grow were tended and prepared for the coming season. Life moved into its next phase, the eternal cycle continuing. But spring brought its own challenges. The melting snow caused the river to swell, and there was always the danger of flooding. The community had to be ready to move to higher ground if necessary. The mud made travel difficult, and there was an increased risk of injury from falls. The weather was unpredictable, capable of shifting from warm sunshine to freezing rain within hours. But these challenges seemed minor compared to the trials of deep winter. There was food to be gathered, work to be done, and the promise of the warm months ahead. Eira stood on the ridge above her settlement one warm spring morning, looking out over the valley that had been her world throughout the long winter. She thought about all that had happened, all that she had learned. She had gained a deeper understanding of what it meant to be human in a world without technology, without the cushion of modern convenience. It meant being strong, but also being part of a community. It meant having knowledge, but also having the wisdom to know when to act and when to wait. It meant respecting nature, understanding its patterns, working with its rhythms rather than against them. She thought about the future, about the winters still to come in her life. She would experience perhaps 40 or 50 more if she was lucky, each one a challenge, each one a test. But she also knew that she would face them with the accumulated wisdom of countless generations, with the support of her community, and with the skills she continued to develop. The winter had been long, the challenges many, but they had survived. And in that survival was a profound accomplishment, a testament to human resilience, adaptability, and the power of community. Looking down at the settlement, Eira could see the signs of renewal everywhere. New hunting equipment was being made, dwellings were being repaired and improved based on lessons learned during the winter, and plans were being made for the coming months. Her father and the other men were discussing whether to expand their settlement, as several young people had paired off during the winter and would need their own dwellings. Her mother was working with other women to prepare seeds for planting, tiny precious kernels that had been saved from previous years. These seeds represented another form of survival wisdom, the beginning of agriculture that would eventually transform human society, though in Eira's time it was still a supplementary activity to hunting and gathering. The ancient people who lived through long winters without any technology weren't superhuman. They were simply humans who had developed the knowledge, skills, and social structures necessary for survival in harsh conditions. They made mistakes, they suffered, they lost loved ones, and they faced constant challenges. But they also celebrated, loved, learned, and passed on their wisdom to the next generation. They understood something that modern people often forget: survival isn't just about individual strength or cleverness. It's about community, cooperation, accumulated knowledge, and the ability to live in harmony with natural cycles. As Eira walked back down to her settlement, she saw her younger sister Lyra playing with other children, laughing in the warm spring sunlight. She saw her father and brother working on repairs to their dwelling, Davin managing despite his injured hand. She saw her mother and grandmother preparing food, talking quietly together, passing knowledge from one generation to the next. She saw her community, battered but unbroken, continuing their ancient dance with the seasons. And she understood that this was how her people had survived not just one long winter, but thousands of them stretching back into the distant past. This was how they would continue to survive, generation after generation, until the world changed so completely that these skills were no longer necessary. But even then, the lessons would remain: community, knowledge, respect for nature, patience, courage, and the understanding that human beings, working together, can survive almost anything. The evening of that spring day, as the sun set in brilliant colors across the western sky, the community gathered one more time. But this wasn't a ceremony of preparation or endurance. This was a celebration of survival, of the triumph of human cooperation and wisdom over the harshest conditions nature could provide. They sang songs that had been sung for countless generations, songs of gratitude and renewal. They told stories not of hardship but of hope, not of fear but of courage. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Eira felt a profound sense of connection to all the people who had come before her, all those who had faced similar winters and survived, all those whose accumulated wisdom had made her own survival possible. She was a link in an unbroken chain stretching back into the mists of time, and forward into a future she could barely imagine. And in that moment, she understood that this was the greatest survival skill of all, the ability to see yourself as part of something larger, something that transcended individual existence, something that would continue long after you were gone. This was what it truly meant to survive.